From listening to records, I just knew what to do. I mainly taught myself.
Myth is a necessary part for civilization's ability to know itself and organize. It allows for history to contextualize itself across a long expanse of time. A given people relate and know themselves through their myths. This truth works in tandem with the knowledge of history. However, just because it is necessary doesn't in any way speak to its nature as supreme. In truth, it is necessary as a form, the substance of which necessarily ought to be transcended. The nature of myth is to lead to the knowledge of the principle underlying the myth. Once the principle is reached, the myth has exhausted itself and is no longer necessary for the understanding and the movement of consciousness toward the absolute. Inherent to the myth, as it relates to us, is for it to be transcended. Thus, it is both necessary and contingent. Necessary as part of the process, but contingent in that it is subject to transcendence. Its essence is to shed itself away for us and for us to make it concrete and no longer a myth. The myth, once elevated to the universal principle, becomes outgrown by reality of this principle, which, like a flower, extends itself forward, leaving its prior form behind. The principle, in its universality, transcends all particular forms of the myth. This principle remains, in itself, unmediated, yet is, once known, mediated as our object of knowing in and for our consciousness. Hitherto this point, the principle was mediated concretely in the myth itself. However, once consciousness discovered its universality, this mediation in myth became superfluous for further knowing. The principle mediated in the world, but only now in our understanding unmediated or pure as our object of knowledge can be embodied and applied to our circumstance, which is to make it concrete again. We no longer need the myth once we have reached this point in knowing, because the myth has led us here through revealing its true essence of the universal principle therein. Once known, it allows us a new shape through which consciousness can actualize itself in its world of experience, eventually leading itself to become the myth concretely. Philosophy provides what myth cannot, namely, movement toward the universal as it is and its being for itself, or our object of knowing, pure and unconditioned. Some may object to this and say that myth helps contextualize the principle, but this objection is of no use. One may ask, if the distinction between the myth and principle is clear, of what use does the myth serve if its nature is already known to us? If the principle is known as distinct from its expression in the myth, then the myth has already been transcended. Prior to this, the myth only held the principle implicitly and not explicitly, and it was the use of philosophy that revealed and elevated its principle to universality. The further objection that myth is easier to remember is hardly an objection, but rather an admission of laziness and lack of will to move one's consciousness forward in its knowing. The opposite could also be said, in that it is much easier to remember the principle which has a nature of generality rather than a story which expresses itself as manifold. In the end, the particular substance of myth is to be transcended once known, and with it, its form. Once the myth as a necessary form of mediation is moved beyond, we ourselves, with our knowledge of the principle, can embody it.